welcome everyone. For those of you who might be, this is your first time here, or even for those of you who've been here for many months now, we're just so thankful that you're here, and we always say, you could be anywhere on a Friday night, but for some reason you're here. And I hope tonight that we would learn something new as we wrap up our series called Welcome to the Garden. So we started with talking about discipleship, and then we talked about fellowship, and finally tonight, all right, it was off. Yeah, so we started with discipleship, then we went on to fellowship, and tonight we're going to talk about mission. And then as I began to think about what living a missional life looks like, it didn't feel so straightforward to me, because while there is a mission to do and proclaim God's work in this world, we're also given individual missions. And I think tonight what I want to look at is to look at a story of someone in the Bible who went through their mission in life and to see how God worked in their life. And I think that we can apply many things as we figure out what is our mission in this world. So we're going to dive right into it. I didn't want to make it so much like a talk. I kind of wanted to do like a little Bible study. So we're going to read through a lot of scripture, if that's okay. But I hope that at the end of this that we would learn something new as we try to accomplish our mission in this world. So we're going to look at the story of David and Goliath and a little bit how the story is in context, right? So God calls Moses to take the Israelites out of Egypt, and Joshua is the one who brings them to the promised land. And then there's this period of Judges, which ends with Samuel, and then the people of Israel wants a king. So they anoint Saul as the king, but then the chapters leading up to this story, Saul is very disobedient, and Samuel was told by God that David would take the throne. And then this is the chapter that we hear about the story called David and Goliath. So we're going to read through this passage, but I'm going to not read every single verse. So I'll give you a little context before we read verse 20. So basically, there's two mountains. There's one mountain with the Israelites, and there's another mountain with the Philistines. And then there's this little valley called the Valley of Elah. So that's the picture of how it looks today. It just disappeared. Okay. So it's actually a place in Israel that you can visit. And on one side is the Israelites, and on the other side are the Philistines. And basically what happens is one man named Goliath comes from the Philistines. He's a warrior who's basically 9 feet tall, and he has all this armor on. And scholars estimate that his armor was anywhere from 150 to 200 pounds. So you can imagine this 9-foot guy in the middle of that valley with 200 pounds of armor. And he's screaming to the other side, to the Israelites, saying, one of you come down and fight me. And whoever wins, the opposing nation will surrender. So he's screaming this for 40 days. And it says in the Bible that King Saul and all the Israelites were greatly feared. And then the story kind of pivots to talk about this boy named David. And essentially what it tells you is that David has this father whose name is Jesse, and David is the youngest of 8 boys. And the oldest 3 boys are in the Israelite armies on the battleground. And Jesse tells David, go bring some food for your brothers. And so also David's also a shepherd. So he tells him to have someone take care of your sheep and then go bring them down food. So verse 20 is where we'll step into this story. So David is on the battle line and he's seeing Goliath. So verse 24, sorry. Yeah. So I'll read from here. It says, when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were very fearful. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will make the man who kills him very wealthy with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Then David said to the men who were standing by him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and rids Israel of this disgrace? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he has dared to defy the armies of the living God? The people answered him in agreement with the saying, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. So basically, the situation is so desperate that King Saul offers a 3-part bribe. So we see he offers cash, we see he offers his wife in marriage, his daughter for marriage, and we see the last one is tax exemption. So it says make his father's house free, but essentially that means tax exemption. I don't know, that feels really weird. I can't imagine like President Biden giving me a mission and then saying like, oh, I'll give you my daughter's hand in marriage. That seems really weird. But the other two definitely is something I could use, free cash, and now that I'm fully working, I definitely can use some tax exemption. But I think what we see here is how desperate King Saul was for somebody to say yes to fight Goliath. So let's keep reading on. It says in verse 28, now Eliab, the oldest brother, his oldest brother, so that's David's oldest brother, heard him when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, why is it that you have come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I myself know your insolence and wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. But David said, what have I done now? Was it not just a question? Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing. And the people replied with the same words as before. So basically, David, who was responsibly got up early, got someone to take care of the sheep, came to greet his brothers with food. And you'd think they'd be happy to see him, but what was his response, his oldest brother? He burned with anger against David. He even calls him to have wickedness in his heart. I don't know, I feel like if I was David, I came all the way, I would expect something more than just anger by my brothers. But we see David doesn't lash out in anger, but rather he responds humbly. And I can imagine the scene of David making fun of or lashing out against his brother, and all the crowds are probably laughing. And look at this little boy, because at this time, David is just a teenage boy. He's from the ages of 13 to 19. That's it. He's very, very young. He's not like a man or anything. He's a very young boy. And we see that he gets opposition by his brother. And we're going to come back to this, but we'll keep reading from now. So we read in verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they informed Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, may no one's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. But Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are only a youth, while he has been a warrior since his youth. And then we read in verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a sheep from the flock, I went out after it and attacked it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it rose up against me, I grabbed it by its mane and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who has saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will save me from the hand of the Philistine. So Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. See, David didn't look around for someone to attack Goliath. He said, I'll do it. And something that's so interesting to me, I think, is when I first heard the story as a kid in Sunday school, I only thought about like, oh, this young boy David like conquered Goliath. Like, that's amazing. But the real question we need to ask is, how did he get here? How did he get to the point for him just to say, yes, I'll be the one who goes fights this Goliath? And this takes us to our first point as we try to figure out how to do the will that God has for our life, and that is, confidence is built in stages. In his defense to Saul, he says, whenever a lion or a bear came to attack, I defended it. And it's interesting, right? Like, the profession David has as a shepherd isn't one where he's like in the market or he's like interacting with people. It's just him alone in a pasture with a bunch of sheep. But it's somehow in those moments in his pasture all alone that God was building him up for this purpose. It wasn't that he had some crazy life that he was preaching the word to everyone. No, it's just that he was in his pasture and taking care of the sheep. And in those moments of taking care of the sheep, that's where God built him the courage to say yes to even a Goliath. So what's our application? It's to win our daily battles. You see, I believe the thing that made David so different was because he won his daily battle. There's probably thousands of other shepherd Israelite boys who could have had this opportunity, but I believe David was the only one ready to say yes. So what are applications we can take from it? We could do something small, right? We read in Joshua 1 verse 8, it says, meditate on your word day and night. Maybe winning your daily battle looks like dedicating your time so that every morning and every night you spend time with God. You might say, I only have quiet time at night, because that's kind of how I do it. But I began to realize that it's so important to start and end your day with God. So maybe winning your battle looks like that. Maybe it's trying to learn self-discipline So you try a fast, which you've never done before. I also just did a fast like 2-3 weeks ago. It was like the first time I've ever done it. But maybe it's something that we would want to do as we want to win our daily battle. Try something new. I think even as I was preparing this message, something God was telling me to do was to to journal down, what have I done for you lately? So on my phone, I have this thing like, what have I done for God? And every night before I sleep, I write everything that I've done for him. Because I began to realize, like, if you're in school and you like fail your assignment or you don't do it in time, you're given a metric, right? It says like you got a 0. Or if you're at work and you don't do your work, you're going to have bad performance reviews or you'll get fired. But how are we measuring how much we're growing for God every day? And I felt God calling me to do this every night before I sleep. What have I done for you? So these are just some applications that we could use in our life, because what made David truly was how he won his every day. So let's keep reading on. So verse 38, it says, Then Saul clothed David with his military attire and put a bronze helmet on his head and outfitted him with armor. And David strapped on his sword over his military attire and struggled at walking, for he had not trained with the armor. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, because I have not trained with them. And David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, that is, in his shepherd's pouch and in his sling, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So you see, Saul puts on his armor on David, but it doesn't fit physically, right? He's too small. He's just a boy. He can't fit into a grown man's armor. But there's something deeper than that. It's that this armor didn't fit David spiritually. This armor was not going to save David and allow him to conquer Goliath. And this goes on to our second point, which is that God will use the unique gifts he's already placed in your hand. See, I think sometimes we shy away from progressing with our walk because we think we don't have the right tools to operate. But one of the most beautiful things about the Bible is how God uses the seemingly inadequate to exceed expectations. Likewise, in this story, David doesn't take the sword or the helmet. He takes his simple shepherd tools, his staff, his sling. And what's even cooler is that David didn't come with the stones, but he goes and he finds 5 stones on the brook. He trusted God to provide everything for him. He didn't even come with the stones he would use to conquer Goliath. God had it there already. So the question we need to get from this is that God will use the unique gifts he's already given you. Don't look at all the things you don't have. Look at how God is building you and have confidence in him. And I think even in my own life, like, could it be that like you're a student for a reason? I think a lot of times when I was a student, I would think like, why am I here studying like all day for this final? How am I being grown by God? But could it be like you're studying for all those times in your quiet, in your being all alone, that God is building something in you? Maybe you're learning patience or time organizational skills or critical thinking. And maybe one day later in life, he's going to use those skills that you had no idea he was building within you, and even being as a student. So I think we should be more aware of how God uses the mundane of our life and how he will use it going on in the future. So be aware of how God has given you the gifts you have, and don't complain about what you don't have, because God will give you all that you need. So let's keep going on. Verse 41, it says, Then the Philistine came and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he was contemptuous of him, for he was only a youth and reddish with a handsome appearance. So the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild animals. But David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a saber, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And then verse 46, This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you and remove your head from you. Then I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines to this day to the birds of the sky and the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this entire assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. The next point we see here is that don't underestimate the power of God. So far in this story, we've seen 3 times where David has been underestimated. The first was with his older brother, when he burned with anger and said, "Why have you come here? You just came here to watch the battle." So in that moment, his brother only saw him fit to watch sheep. The second was when King Saul told David, "You're not able to go conquer this Goliath, for you're only a young man." See, at that time, Saul underestimated that David could actually win this battle. And now here on the battle line, Goliath looks at David and he despises him. And he's so taken aback that he would come with a simple staff and not even put armor on. He thinks he's that like arrogant, and he's so mad at David coming in that manner. And I think there's something that we need to learn here, is that people will underestimate you. It could be from the enemy like Goliath, that Satan might be telling you, you're not good enough to do this mission or to do the work that God has for you. It could be society like King Saul telling you that you don't have enough. Like the rest of the world doesn't need to do this. Just don't worry about it. Or it could even be your inner circle. Could be your family or your friends that are actually underestimating you. It's interesting how David responds. In each case, David could have said, "Oh yeah, you're right," and backed off, but he didn't. And we read in verse 45, he says, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a saber, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of the armies. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us." See, the craziest part is, to David, Goliath was the underdog. Goliath was the one who had the armor and was 9 feet tall. But on David's perspective, he didn't say, "You come to me with a sword, I come to you with a slingshot." He says, "You come to me with a sword, but I come to you with the backing of the Lord of the armies." To David, Goliath was the underdog. It's crazy, like the entire nation, the entire Philistines, Goliath, even his own nation, his family, everybody said, "You're not going to win." But David was the only one to realize that he wasn't the underdog. It was Goliath, because it was David who had God with him. So the enemy wants you to underestimate your ability on our mission. But God needs you to understand the way that David did, that the battle belongs to him, and all we have to do is act in faith. So let's read the end, the last few verses, and see what happens. So verse 48, it says, "Then it happened, when the Philistine came close to David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone penetrated his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and the stone." We see that when the battle starts, David runs. And it kind of reminds me of that Avengers Endgame scene when both things are running towards each other. It gives me that feel like both of them are running. And it's so crazy. I can't imagine David just running, charging to this 9-foot giant. And it's also cool just how was a slingshot used? It's cool the physics behind it, right? There's a study done about during David and Goliath, and it said that a skilled slingshot person could throw a stone at 62 miles an hour. It's cool because he could have used a bow and arrow, but the likelihood, chances that arrow would have just went through or bounced off Goliath's helmet. But this stone was exactly what he needed to conquer Goliath. And then we're going to read the last 3 verses, but what happens in between is Goliath falls, David ensures that he's dead, and all the Philistines flee. And Israel is able to conquer the Philistines, and it's a great victory for Israel. And then this is the last 3 verses of this passage. It says in verse 55, "Now when Saul had seen David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, 'Abner, whose son is this young man?' And Abner said, 'By your life, O king, I do not know.' And the king said, 'You then ask whose son the youth is.' So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. Then Saul said to him, 'Whose son are you, young man?' And David answered, 'I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite.'" So the final point we can take from this passage is that you have to face your fears to progress. It's interesting how this story fits in context of David's life. You see, God had the will that God had for David was to be king of Israel. But how would it be that this young boy who's alone in the fields as a shepherd would become the king of a nation? David had to step up to the call and conquer Goliath for him to really progress to the will that God had for him. And it's interesting too, like the chapter right before this, we learn that David is a really great musician. And in fact, he even plays for Saul sometimes in his palace. Yet now that he's conquered Goliath, Saul doesn't even know who he is. And at the end of this chapter, he's asking who he is, which means he never even he didn't know David when he was a musician in his palace. But now, after this great battle and is progressing through facing his fear, now he wants to actually know who this kid is. And the next chapter we read, it says, "From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family." So this story of David and Goliath was pivotal in allowing David to enter into kingship. And eventually God would make him the next king of Israel, and that's where his will would be done for the Lord. So just to summarize what we learned from this. First, we learned that confidence is built in stages, and that your battlefield is in the everyday. Second, we learned that God will use the unique gifts he's given you. So don't look at what you don't have. Look at what God has already placed in your hand. The third thing we learned is don't underestimate God. Satan wants you to think that you're unable to continue with the mission, but God wants you to rest in his strength. And finally, the fourth point, we need to learn to face our fears to progress. So I started my message by making this distinction that, there's the mission that individually we have into doing God's will, but then there's also the mission that we as a body of believers need to accomplish. And I think that being aware and knowledgeable of what God has provided us in our mission will help us to understand the true meaning of life. And this is the mission that we aim to accomplish here at the Garden. So let's try to understand where God has placed us. Here in Long Island, we live in one of the most educated, affluent, and influential places in the world. Just a few miles away is New York City, which is arguably the Mecca city of the world. In fact, the UN headquarters is in New York City. Literally, the headquarters of the entire earth is in New York City, in that UN building. And it doesn't even belong to the US. It's a world entity. The population of this one little island is over 8 million people. And the population of this little island is more than the population in half the countries in the entire world. Yet, we are one of the most under-churched regions. There's many studies done that shows that our area is so under-churched. And we can attest to that, right? Many of you are from Hofstra University, right? I'm sure your Christian club just has a few dozen kids, but the amount of students in your campus is over 10,000. That doesn't even include professors, workers, or visitors. Just think about how many people there are that might have never heard the name of Jesus. And there's just a few dozen kids in InterVarsity that could be the cause for change. Even here at the Garden, right? How many other Friday ministries are there around us? I'm sure there's a few churches, right? But that halts into comparison of all the bars and clubs and restaurants where millions of people flock to at the end of the week. You see, God put us here for a reason. Our goal is not to live for this world. It's not to get the most prestigious degree or make the most money. And yes, God might use your degree and your money for his will. But your goal is to accomplish the will that God has for you. So that one day when we get to heaven, we would hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." He's not going to say, "Well done, thank you for getting a 4.0 in college." Or, "Well done, you aced your chemistry test." Or, "Well done, you were the top 10% in your career." He's going to say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So as I call the worship team up, I want to close with this last question. When your moment comes, what will you do? You see, when you go home tonight and you wake up tomorrow morning, your battle will resume in how you use your time and how you interact with those around you. And I highly encourage you to make a change of action here tonight. I mentioned a few before, right? You can make it a point to start and end your day with God. Maybe before any school assignments or your workday, you pray, saying that, "God, I want to do everything for your glory." Maybe You need to reach out to fellow brothers and sisters and ask them, how can I be praying for you? Maybe it's creating a prayer list and being dedicated to pray for that person or those people every day. Maybe God is asking you to confess a sin that you've been hiding. He's asking you to step out of this so you can grow. I remember even when I was in college, I was the SAT tutor for this underprivileged place in Jersey City, and I felt God telling me that every Friday to carry a Bible. And my goal was that at the end of that Friday, my goal was that I would hand that Bible to somebody. And even if I didn't hand that Bible to somebody, I would put it in an area that someone would see it. I think we need to be more aware of how our daily life impacts the will that God has for us. And really tonight, I think we should try to make a change of action. Because I'm tired of being spiritually filled after a message or a worship song and that lasting for a few hours or days. I'm tired of just my faith being like a boat that goes back and forth without ever making any real progress. And I'm tired of coming short to the standard that David has set before us. We need to persevere in our everyday life so that when our Goliaths come, we will be ready to say yes. That could be like stepping into a new leadership role, or it could be to how you respond to a trial or a tribulation in your life, or it could be using an opportunity that God has clearly shown you to share the gospel with someone new and to bring a lost soul back home. My hope is that we truly understand our purpose in this life, accomplishing the will that God has for you, knowing that collectively we have been positioned in such an abundant harvest with very, very few workers. The Lord has called us for this mission. Will you retreat and hide like Saul did? Or will you be the one that runs like David? My prayer for myself and for all of us is that we would run, longing to hear God say, "Well done, good and faithful servant."